of weeds. And I know the title sounds a bit not right, because we've always had this hate relationship with weeds in our gardens. But what I'll hope to show you today is a totally different understanding of how we need to approach our weeds in the garden. So when we look at our current view of weeds, most of us will assume that they are pretty useless. We must poison them, get rid of them, and they really serve no purpose in our gardens. And somehow they always seem to grow where we don't want them to grow, right in the middle of our veggie patch that we've just cleared, or where we created a nice flower bed, up pops the weeds. But when you start looking, they're always the first plants to grow on a barren land. When you've cleared the land, they're the first ones to pop up. And they seem to have the ability to survive in very harsh conditions, because you don't water them, you just leave them alone, but somehow they will grow and multiply. What we need to first step back and look at is that weeds are also plants, and therefore also living entities and part of the vertical people. They are also living reactors, and they have a very special role in nature. What we first have to look at is, the old saying, as above, so below. This works very well in nature as well, because when you have a look at what's in your soil is what creates what's above your soil. And the two always interact. And what nature is always trying to do is to create a balance between what's in the soil and what's above the ground. And that's the whole objective for nature. When we look at exposed soils from farming, so a farmer's just gone and you've cleared a patch of land that you're wanting to grow, nature will want to cover that open soil as fast as possible, because it's like an open wound on our skin and it's unbalanced. The energy fields are unbalanced. So what happens to do this, the weeds appear first, as they have the ability to grow under very harsh conditions and to grow very fast. We know how fast the weeds grow. We can plow up a piece of land and within a few days you've got the weeds coming up and growing already. They're able to spread their seeds very quickly because they grow so fast, and in no time your whole land is covered in weeds, or your whole garden bed is covered in weeds. And this is fantastic, as you will see later on. When I've taken an example of two common weeds in the gardens, there's the dandelion and stinging nettle. Both of these weeds are also used in herbal medicines. So when you have a look at the, just a breakdown of some of the chemical compositions, if you look at dandelion, it has calcium, phosphorus, iron, sodium, and potassium. When you look at stinging nettle, it's also got calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc and copper, and potassium as well. So these two weeds, as we call them, have a lot of mineral content in them. So when we look at an exposed soil, the soil, which is also a living entity, will encourage the weeds to grow first and multiply, because they're the strongest and will grow first. If we just think of and imagine ourselves walking through an open field where there's no ground, where there's no plants on it, it'll give us a totally different feeling than walking through a field that has 100 variety of different plants and flowers. It gives us a nicer feeling when we walk through those fields. And that all comes down to the magre fields that we're getting from the various plants. So when you're looking at a barren piece of soil, you're getting very little fields, except basically only those that are coming from the ground and not from your vegetation and your plants. The type of weeds that also grow up will vary from area to area and are dependent upon your soil conditions. Essentially, the weeds are nature's way of trying to restore that balance very quickly, because nature hates an open, barren piece of land. Will always try to cover that barren land. So what you're seeing is, by allowing the weeds to multiply, die back into the soils, seed again, and repeat the cycle, nature is adding back into the soils a huge amounts of elements, amino acids, and organic materials. This in turn will start feeding the organisms in your soil. They'll multiply and do their work, freeing up additional elements in the soils. And these changes in the fields signal other seeds that the conditions have changed, they are now better, and so you're going to get a more variety of seeds that are going to start to germinate in your field. Over time, the weeds will reduce and other varieties of plants will begin to grow. These other varieties of plants also add to your different elements, your amino acids, resulting in a soil structure that is full of life. So when you have your living soil is balanced, you'll also have a living plant variety on the surface that is also coming into balance. So we essentially get back to the same principles where everything is interacting with everything else to find this balance. And that's what nature is always striving for. So a summary of that approach to the weeds, nature is far more intelligent than we give it credit for. Weeds have been given a very bad reputation because of our lack of understanding of what nature is trying to do through the weeds. So I think it's also time that we rename the weeds as healers, because they will want to tend to heal the land, and as they're also used in herbal medicine to heal people and animals. And you'll often hear some stories where a person who falls ill, and then they'll start finding certain weeds that will pop up in their gardens. And when they look into those weeds and what they've traditionally been used in herbal medicine, a lot of the time those weeds will turn out to be something that the people can use as a cure. You've heard this story many, many times. So the practical approach to weeds, what I've tried to get across here is that if you've got an open piece of land and you start seeing your weeds growing, they're going to take over in no time and start multiplying, and you're going to have a whole field full of weeds. And if you allow those to grow and die back down, obviously they will multiply, come back again. And over time, looking at a couple of years, you'll start seeing other weeds that'll come through. And eventually, after a few years, you will see that those weeds don't come back anymore. You'll have a whole variety of other plants that have grown on that field. And your weeds are not there anymore. A lot of research has been done on this over the years. It's a totally different approach, the traditional sort of farming approach. But now that we begin to understand how the plasma works with the plants, we now see how the weeds, because of their high mineral content, are always adding back to the soil. So when we can have a look at our weeds in the garden, there's several ways we can approach this to use them. We can just pull them out and leave them on the soil, because they'll decompose back into your soil, adding that nutrition back into your soil. You can collect your various weeds that you've identified, and then you can make a gans of them, just like you can make a food gans. You can then drink that water from the gans that you've made, and you can also use that water to water your garden. Because if you look at the composition of those two plants there, they have a lot of minerals in there. So it will be very good for you if you create a food gans out of that one and feed it back to your garden. And if you really don't want weeds at all in your garden, then what you can do is you can pull them out and burn them. And then this ash will contain the elements and carbon from the plants, and you can place this ash back onto your garden. So we have to start understanding and researching the weeds that we have in our garden, because often they will give us an indication of what's happening with our health, and gives you an indication that your soils are also out of balance.